Lately, when things happen, but this is kind of what came to my mind on Wednesday morning. This is Edvard Munch's famous painting, The Scream, right? Sort of that primal scream when you don't have the words to express what you're feeling. And I think, speaking as one who has done a lot of work with crisis debriefing and work as a trauma chaplain, one of the important steps that we need to take before we can jump immediately, as we are wont to do, to reconciliation, is a little debrief. Debriefing is important. And so we need to kind of own and claim some of what we're feeling at the moment before we can begin to talk about how to talk about it. My goal for today is to give you a little brief summary of what we talked about last week and then move into what may seem on the surface to be a simplistic idea, but a little, I'm going to show you part of a tape or a video on by Stephen Carter called "Is Civility Important?" I think we all have an answer to that question right now. But he does get at something that seems to be lacking at the moment, especially on our social media posts. So what I'd like us to do, and you can just shout it out, is throw up some words that describe what this week was for you. Just some words, 1 word, 2 words.
Sadness.
Okay. Other words?
Worry.
Worry.
Anger.
Surprise.
Disappointment. Can you speak for someone else who's not in the room who might say that they were happy with the outcome? All right,
Sure.
so happy, some elation. You won't mind that I spoke.
All feelings are valid. All feelings are valid.
Say and add one to surprise, but probably incredulous.
Anxiety.
I'm going to put that up here.
You only got fear. Actual fear.
Hopeful.
Hopeful.
Mm.
How about,
Finally.
okay.
Why? Why? How? Searching, as in what would be a constructive response.
Okay. How to respond.
Yeah. Not surprised.
Not surprised.
Expected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thrilled.
Thrilled.
Relief.
Relief. There is some of that going around.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I'd say that's pretty representative of where we are right now, nationally and right here at Grace Church.
Judy, can I add one more?
Yep.
So, divisive, divisiveness,
How about divided?
divided, that works too.
If you add on the post-election behavior of the majority groups towards minority, that opens up a whole other realm of emotions, but probably that's accurate for, the election in its own right.
Is there a word we could use to give voice to some of what's been happening behavior?
I think that people have like a sense of freedom to finally maybe say some of those things that they've been thinking.
How about permission giving?
The paper had an article this morning where white Villanova males beat up a black Villanova female.
Yeah.
That's absurd.
That's one of the things, many things that are said. Okay. So, feelings are valid, legitimate, right? No one can tell us how to change our feelings. Actions that come out of those feelings are not necessarily legitimate. And I think where we are at the moment is caught between those two. So my goal for today is to help us as people here in this community of faith, begin to think about ways that we can talk and listen to one another to start to hear some of these things. And there's a reason that I put anxiety and fear at the top of the list. Right? Because some of these things are reactions to or come out of our anxiety and fear. And sometimes we allow our anxiety and fear to dictate our actions. Yes, even as hopeful, faithful people, we are still human beings. So let me do a little bit of review and then hopefully get to some Stephen Carter today. And by the way, this is not new material on his part, but I'll be anxious to see his reaction when he comes along, because I know he will. So last week we looked at this idea of covenant as it shapes our Christian identity. And covenant, as it comes to us through the biblical witness, is based on a particular understanding of God as one who promises to always, in everything, be with us, to know us, and to love us, regardless of how life impacts us, or our level of response to that promise. We also discussed the differences between a covenant and a contract, lifting up the reality of covenant as necessary for and instrumental in creating community. We are covenant people. When push comes to shove in a covenantal relationship, you'll respond from what makes life more meaningful than what is required by the fine print in a contract. A covenant is an attempt to imitate what we believe to be true of God, who creates in love before demanding obedience. Covenants create community. Those who honor covenants participate in the kind of community that a covenant supports. And most of us don't like to hear this, covenants also require sacrifice. In the old days, you sacrificed an animal, you cut it into equal parts to represent your covenant between you and God. Cut a covenant as when you take a wedding vow. A covenant always asks, what do I owe others because of who I am? These are all good questions for us to be looking at right now. Contract, on the other hand, manages exchanges between people. It creates a system of transactions. It's concluded or settled, not offered or made. And it uses language of requirement. What do I require from others in this relationship? What am I willing to give to receive what I need? A community like this one in covenant creates a space. It can be a family space, a space where faith is expressed, even a public space where we live together. We share a commitment to one another, and we're able to treat one another with a generosity that springs from what we owe each other as children of God. And I like to think here we create a safe space, a space of safety to express what we're going through. When we live together in covenant communities, we sacrifice for one another, and we trust time-honored rituals of forgiveness and acceptance to work through the conflicts that will inevitably arise. So I submit to you that throughout the election cycle, we as a nation have experienced a collective breakdown of trust, a decline in civility and bipartisanship, that ability to work across the aisle, and outright hostility between people whose opinions differ. So how do we begin again? Better yet, how do we as Christians live into Jesus' call to accountability found in our gospel witness? In Matthew 7, verses 1 through 12, he writes, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove that speck from your brother's eye. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." And then a little bit earlier in Matthew, in the 5th chapter, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So probably most of us are not quite that perfect, right? The covenants we make with each other are imperfect expressions of how God relates to us. We know that and we live with that. In order to move forward, we need to pause, acknowledge where we've been, do some debriefing. That's called confession, by the way, in church. Do some truth-telling and forgive one another. Then, and only then, can we really begin to seek common ground. And I think that civility, that old-fashioned notion, is a good place to start. It's a way of relating to one another that enhances civic discourse, that funny term. How many have heard that term lately?
Yeah.
Civic discourse, the ability to sit down. Yep.
As David Brooks
Yes,
is big on that.
he is. The ability to sit down and have a civil conversation with one another, right? There's a place called the Institute for Civility in Government, and they say that civility is about more than just politeness. Although politeness is necessary as a first step, it's about disagreeing without disrespect, seeking common ground as a starting point for dialogue about differences, listening past one's preconceptions. Anybody in here without any preconceptions whatsoever about anybody else? Oh, Rob, go. And teaching others to do the same. Civility is the hard work of staying present even with those with whom we have deep-rooted and fierce disagreements. It's political in the sense that it's a necessary prerequisite for civic action. I'm going to read that again. Civility is political in the sense that it's a necessary prerequisite for civic action. We can't do if we can't understand each other, if we can't sit down and have a conversation with one another. It will be very difficult to form common ground and then a common goal toward which we're working. But it's political too in the sense that it's about negotiating interpersonal power such that everyone's voice is heard and nobody's is ignored. I have a feeling there are an awful lot of people in the country right now who have felt and are feeling and are afraid that they will be ignored. And that, my friends, cuts down both sides of the political spectrum. We cannot say it's one or the other. It's both. Even though we are anxious, fearful, sad, worried, angry, relieved, disappointed, elated, incredulous, surprised, we cannot afford to be complacent. Politics at its core is about how we make decisions in any group for the group. It's about how we make decisions in any group for the group. One of the major contributions the church can make to larger society is to model the process by which we make decisions. Think about that for a minute. When you're sitting the next time in your small group or your deacons meeting or your session meeting or your team meeting, how does your team go about the process of making decisions, right? And then you might wonder, after you've had that same meeting for the third or fourth time, why we have such a hard time nationally trying to come to some terms of agreement about a particular course of action. I wrestled with this because there's another video I like as well that I want to show us. But I've decided to save that for next week because that speaks to our broader role as a church. And that's what I'd like to talk about next week. I'm going to show some of Stephen Carter. Stephen Carter is at Yale, longtime professor there. William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law. And sometimes he can be a little bit pedantic, but I find him compelling in this clip. So I'd like to show part of this to us and then talk about a little bit about where you find some positives in his suggestions about how we should treat one another going forward. All right, just about the end of that clip. So we have like 2 minutes to reflect before I have to run off, and some of us have to run off. I'm going to pick this up at the beginning of next week, and next week I want to expand this idea of what we personally owe one another in our dialogue, process of dialogue, and talk about what we owe one another ends within the church and outside of the church. So, any one-word response, one word that might be different than the word you started with today? Listen.
Enlightened.
Enlightened.
I was saying thought provoking, but it's 2 words.
No, that's not.
That's a whole
I
thing.
think. That was like that. Thank you.
Mine's like them kind of also, I was thinking, open-mindedness.
That clip comes from 2005.
Oh.
Oh, really? Which I find very interesting, and yet still applicable to where we are right
Wasn't Obama elected in 08? And he was just mentioning,
now. As far as I can see from
Okay. All right,
what they said.
whatever.
So, a while ago, still relevant. Still time.
I'll text him.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And next week we'll pick up with the church.